All right, this presentation is about pruning. And pruning can be a very basic concept and a very advanced concept. And there's a lot of different types of pruning, and it takes a lot of practice. So we're going to talk about some of the different strategies that are associated with pruning in grapes, not specifically just wine. So we'll look at the objectives. What are we trying to accomplish with pruning? We'll talk about fruitfulness, the three major types of pruning: spur, short cane, and long cane pruning. We've pretty much only talked about spur pruning in this class, but that's not the only way to prune grapes. There are other approaches depending on the type of grapes and your ultimate product you're trying to grow. And so we'll talk about these different pruning systems. So first of all, the objectives of pruning. What are you trying to accomplish? And you're trying to control the size and structure of the vine predominantly. You're trying to keep the vine in a manageable, healthy, effective shape that will grow year after year a consistent product. And if you don't prune properly, things can have all kinds of side effects. The extensively productive vines that aren't pruned, you get so much canopy formation, things get touching the ground, they're touching other vines in ways that help spread disease, that produce very dense canopy, which is high moisture content, which promotes fungal and bacterial problems. So you need to keep the plants in a consistent size and shape. And we also want to regulate crop size. Unlike most of the things we deal with in agricultural crops, where more is better, always more is better. We want more lettuce per acre, more spinach per acre, more broccoli per acre, more strawberries per acre. Well, with grapes, there's a sweet spot. And if you go past the sweet spot, you end up reducing the quality of the grapes. The idea is there's only so many roots per acre and so many leaves per acre. And those roots and leaves can only produce so much sugar and phenolics and other components that make a quality grape. And if you have too much of the grape clusters, too many pounds per acre of grapes, you're going to have to take that total possible production of sugars and other flavor compounds and spread them over more grapes, and a reduction in quality. So you're also trying to maintain a balance. And it's not just the pounds per acre, but there's this balance between growth of leaves and shoots and fruiting. And you want to find, again, a sweet spot, the ideal balance between the two, where you have enough leaves on big enough shoots to provide the solar panels, the photosynthesis sites, to create the energy to grow fruit, to grow the berries. And ultimately, the berry clusters is your crop, with a very minor side business of selling grape leaves to Greek people. Grew up with a very close friend of my dad's was Greek, and the family still friends, but grape leaves wrapping rice and lamb was one of those things whenever we would celebrate with our Greek friends. But you don't grow very many grape leaves and make huge profits, sell a bunch of grape leaves. You sell a few in some places, but it's really all about berries. And so you want the yield potential And when it says maximizing yield potential, it's meaning hitting that perfect target, not the maximum level, but the fruit potential or yield potential is hitting your target while maintaining the health of the plant. If you push the target too far, you put too many grapes, you actually can harm the vine for next year. There's not enough storage for next year. So you get a really big crop this year. Not only did you reduce the value of this year's crop, you have the added negative of that is going to reduce the storage of energy in the roots over the winter. And in spring, you're not going to get as much growth, and that will affect next year's crop. So a lot of things coming together. We've talked about fruitfulness of grapevines. The fruitfulness depends on the variety, the genetics of the scion, as well as the vigor of the rootstock that the scion is grafted to, plus your foliar management, the things you do during the spring and summer months that allow sunlight to penetrate into the canopy during and after flowering, being primary components of this fruitfulness concept with canopy management. And essentially, fruitfulness involves the number of clusters per bud, as well as the weight of the clusters, the average weight of those clusters. And when we did our calculations, you'll remember that we generally use a 3 clusters per bud as our standard, but then you never get that as an average because not every bud is going to give you 2 clusters. Some of them are going to give you only 1 cluster. And so it depends on how common is that 1 cluster. That reduces it below 2, and that's where we have our fruitfulness index that we use to adjust our calculations. And we get that from what? Bud dissections. Plus historical data. You can make estimates on historical data, but historical data doesn't take into account actual growing practices, diseases, and other things. You got to do the bud dissections to really know what's going on. So fruitfulness, 1 year old and 2 year old are the fruitful wood, the ones that carry the clusters. So this is shoots from this year's growth. This is the spur, which is 2 year old wood. And then the permanent trunk, 3 or more, the cordon, or depending on how you prune it, there might be different terminology, but the way we've been talking, you've got your cordon, your spur, and this year's, in this case, canes. They're old and lignified, so they're canes. If they were green and younger, we would call them shoots. 1 year, 2 year, 3 or more. So when we look at fruitfulness, the natural fruitfulness actually can increase from the basal position to the apical position. So you go from the basal position near the cordon up to the nodes out towards the growing tip, the apical meristem. And different varieties have fruitfulness in different locations along the shoot or cane. And so varieties like the Flame or Victoria, the Red Globe Autumn Royal, the Thompson Seedless, and Dauphine, these are table grapes. These are eating table grapes. And so they have different places where they are going to be most fruitful. And you need to know that, because if you prune the wrong way for the wrong types of grapes, you're going to end up pruning in a way that is not going to be effective for where the clusters are going to ultimately develop. So again, with most of the wine grapes, we can use a simple cordon structure with spur pruning works great for a lot of the wine varieties, the common wine varieties that we grow, but that's not all grapes. Thompson seedless, again, a table grape. And so looking at sun and shade, number of clusters per node. You can see here that at node 1, you don't get very many clusters. But where do you get most of the clusters? Out here in this range. This is where you get your high amount of clusters. And you can see if there is some sun reaching into the canopy, you get more clusters than if you end up getting too shaded of a canopy due to excessive leaves and shoots. So short spurs have 2 buds left on a spur. Again, the standard we've talked about. High fertility cultivars on a cordon trellis. So flame seedless, Victoria. And if you look at these names, this presentation is talking about pruning from the point of view of table grape folks, if you haven't already noticed. But the same concept is true. This is where much of our wine varieties, wine cultivars would fall within this short spur pruning technique, but not all of them. The half long or short canes, you prune for 5 to 8 buds. So instead of leaving just 2 buds on a short spur, you leave 5 to 8 buds on a short cane. And so those are for medium fertile cultivars like the Red Globe and Autumn Royale, and then the cane pruning, low fertility cultivars like the Thompson seedless and Kishmish. Productivity of Sauvignon Blanc. Here's a wine grape. And so we're looking at pruning method, a 2-bud spur versus a 4-bud spur versus a cane pruning. What's the difference? How many clusters per vine are you getting? Clearly, if you have more buds that you leave per more buds that you leave per pruning unit, short spur, longer spur, or short cane it could be called, or cane pruning, you're ending up getting more the more buds you leave. That only goes to simple logic. You leave more buds to develop next year, that means more shoots, that means more fruit. And so you have to take that into consideration. What's the vigor of my rootstock? What's the growth climate in which I'm producing these grapes? What's the product I'm after? What's my target yield? You need to find the right balance, that sweet spot for your yield. And so by looking at these clusters per vine in this example, that gives you an idea of what you might yield. But then they have cluster weights as well. And in this case, they're actually going up with a total weight going up dramatically per vine. How many grams of grapes per vine being produced? And you might say, wow, if I just leave more buds, I do cane pruning, I get more fruit, more yield. Again, you're not talking about hitting maximum yield, you're talking about the sweet spot, especially in wine grapes. It's a different world in raisins and the table grapes. I don't even get into that because I have zero experience, and we don't have a lot of growers doing raisins and table grapes that I've talked to. So what is the sweet spot for those commodities? Got to do a little reading on your own, talk to some growers on your own, or go out and work for somebody. Anyway, spur pruning, used for varieties that shows high enough fruitfulness on the basal buds. Makes sense? You don't want to leave only 2 buds if those basal buds have low fertility. low fruitfulness. That doesn't make sense. Prune all the buds off, leave the last two when your real fruiting happens around 5 to 7 or 6 to 10. If your fruitfulness is up higher, you got to leave more of those canes or short canes. The vine structure is a permanent cordon system. Certainly that is what we've mostly talked about this year. Shoot positioning, normally vertical, like the VSPs we've talked about. There's also a gable trellis, wide trellis, the lyre, which, again, there's a number of names that are very similar types of trellising designs, but these lend themselves very well to spur pruning. Spacing between the spurs along the cordon, you tend to have them in the 12 to 15 centimeter range, and it's really important to have good proper spacing for sunlight penetration and also space between the clusters. You want the clusters along the cordon, along the shoots above the cordon to be spaced appropriately, have room to grow, etc. And I'm going to take a quick break here.